Hello there. Welcome back to the Level 2 lessons for the Star Wars Unlimited Judge program. As always, I'm your host Jonah, and this is the final L2 core lesson covering the Master Event document. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the Unsporting Conduct category of tournament disruptions. Unsporting Conduct is a broad term that covers a wide range of poor behavior that is unwanted at events, but isn't necessarily directly regulated by the rules or policy documents. As always with policy, this is an area that is continually being refined and will grow and evolve as play continues to evolve. This does make it a bit of a challenge to both learn and teach, so this is likely a lesson that will similarly evolve over time. As has been discussed throughout our lessons on policy and logistics, one of our primary goals is to ensure that all participants have an enjoyable experience. To that end, all participants, whether they're someone showing up to their first event or an entrenched member of the community, whether they're a player, spectator, or staff member, are all held to the same standards of politeness and respect. The Master Event document lays out some specific behaviors that cross the line and penalties associated with them. There aren't really remedies for these infractions because unlike gameplay disruptions and tournament disruptions, there isn't a mechanical impact to a game or a match. It's purely social or behavioral. Opposite of unsporting conduct is sporting conduct. This includes many things players do automatically, introducing themselves at the start of the match, saying good luck and good game at the beginning and end of the match, and generally being a positive experience to play with and against. However, there's a category that falls between that space, between sporting behavior and unsporting behavior. This undesirable behavior in the middle is allowed. This can include things like not saying good luck at the beginning of the match when your opponent does, or taking advantage of misplays by the opponent. Particularly at competitive tier events, players are held to an expectation of skill and dedication. If a player makes a tactical mistake, even if the error is obvious, it is absolutely not a requirement of their opponent to let them take it back or to not take advantage of it. Similarly, per the rules, players are not required to point out optional effects belonging to their opponent, even if they think that the player accidentally missed them and didn't intentionally decline them. Players can be short and curt with their language, unfriendly or unexciting to play against. They can take advantage of better rules knowledge to win games. While it is incorrect to infract and penalize this behavior, it can sometimes be correct in your role as a community facilitator to have a conversation with this unpleasant player about their actions and how it impacts not only the play experience of the other players in the community, but how it impacts the player themselves. If a player is more assertive and contentious, their opponents are going to reflect that behavior, and the player is going to have a worse time. However, there are behaviors that are simply not acceptable. Some examples are listed in the Master Event document, but that list is not exhaustive. It is important to note that inappropriate behavior does not have to be intentional or malicious. A player can do something that they believe is appropriate, but it still crosses the line. Because of this, the penalty for a player's first unsporting conduct minor, USC minor, is between 2 and 8 penalty points. While the default is 4 points, a player demonstrating genuine remorse may receive 2, and a player who is potentially more intentional or malicious may receive 8. A player who repeats the inappropriate behavior in the same event should be disqualified. Here are some examples of inappropriate behavior: using vulgar or profane language and gestures, or having inappropriate images or text on their belongings and game materials, demanding that an opponent receive a penalty. Note that asking what penalty their opponent receives, or otherwise seeking clarity, especially if the opponent is not immediately present, but sometimes even if they are, is not grounds for this infraction. Being like, hey judge, is there a penalty for this? That's not demanding your opponent get a penalty. Saying, I thought that came with a warning or a game loss. Again, not demanding a penalty. This person is seeking clarity. Seeking or giving outside assistance, information from outside a match, is another unsporting conduct minor. Failure to follow instructions from a tournament official. The instructions must be reasonable, and the player has the opportunity to seek clarity before following instructions. Judge authority isn't absolute. If you tell a player, you need to leave now, the player's like, I'm currently playing a match. That's not them failing to follow instructions. That's them being like, I have a different set of instructions that I'm trying to follow, or I'm trying to do something for this event. If you tell a player, I need you to get to your match now, and they're like, hey, I lost a card last round, I don't know what happened to it, I'm buying a replacement from a vendor. They're not disobeying your instructions, they're trying to proceed with the tournament. So again, like with all of these, it requires some amount of judgment. Leaving excessive trash at table can be grounds for an unsporting conduct minor. This is on the order of leaving like a whole booster box worth of wrappers on a table, or a large quantity of like food. Leaving a bottle of water, a bottle of soda, or a couple booster pack wrappers, or something along those lines is very far from excessive. While we do want players to be taking their trash with them, issuing penalties for players not taking their trash aggressively will cause players to get very frustrated and unhappy with the event. Excessive physical displays, throwing your deck in anger or frustration, jumping wildly in celebration, both of these are out of line just because of the disruption that they can cause to the event. Finally, any sort of insult towards another person is just not appropriate. You also want to keep the venue and experience that is being curated in mind. Some events occur after hours or in venues that have a purely adult demographic, and so some language that may not be acceptable at an event that has families and children can be acceptable at a different event. There's also unsporting conduct major, which is harassment. It's a more extreme version of inappropriate behavior. This includes the use of any sort of slurs, whether it's directed at a person or not, taking inappropriate photos of another person, making persistent unwanted social advances, asking someone for their Discord handle or phone number, asking if they want to play some games later between rounds. Doing that is appropriate. If the person declines, the issue should not be pursued further. Implicit threats of inappropriate physical behavior, such as getting in someone's path, or unwanted physical contact, giving an unwanted hug, grabbing at them, these are harassment. And bullying through social media is also considered here. Harassment doesn't need to take place in person while at the venue, but if it occurs online while at the venue, it can be equally disruptive to the affected player and should be handled seriously. Bullying that happens through social media outside the bounds of the event, so before or after, isn't really something that we can regulate, and this is not something that we should be hunting for. But if a player comes to us and says, hey, somebody tweeted something about me last round and I feel harassed by it, we should absolutely look into that. The penalty for harassment, whether or not the player demonstrates remorse or took the harassing action intentionally, is disqualification. For players who show remorse and were not aware that their behavior was inappropriate, it can sometimes be reasonable to allow them to remain in the venue and continue to participate in other events that may be taking place. However, it is also reasonable, especially with smaller venues where they're likely to cross paths with the impacted participant again, that they should be ejected from the venue. As a reminder, while it is at the discretion of the head judge on whether or not a player is disqualified, it is the responsibility of the tournament organizer, who's in charge of the space, to determine whether a player is ejected from the venue, although they can absolutely consult the head judge on their decision. From here on out, the penalties for all these infractions is disqualification, and frequently removal from the venue is also recommended. Aggressive behavior is any sort of explicit physical threat or action aimed at another participant. Threatening to strike a person, pulling a chair out from underneath someone, throwing game components at someone, flipping a table, shouting in anger, or threatening to bring a weapon all fall under aggressive behavior. Similarly, actually following through on any of those or taking any of those actions is also aggressive behavior. Damaging or taking possessions of another participant, the organizer, or the venue is strictly not allowed. Taking excess cards from draft, or intentionally keeping a card you realized you picked up from an opponent accidentally, both fall under this category. Similarly, stealing a table number or a store display is considered theft. Telling a member of staff that you have not received a promo or some other participation prize, even though you already have, in order to get additional copies, also theft. As with most other unsporting conduct infractions, the penalty for theft or vandalism is disqualification. Moving on to bribery and collusion. Bribery is a relatively straightforward infraction. A player offering another participant a reward or incentive in order to change the outcome of a match or ruling is strictly not allowed. Furthermore, accepting a bribe falls under the same condition, saying, I'll give you a pack if you scoop to me, or even if a spectator's like, hey, this game's going to go to time, I just want to start the next round, I'll give a pack to whichever player scoops first. That's bribery. Collusion is a little bit more of a complicated topic, and so we're going to take a little bit longer to discuss it. Collusion is when players discuss explicitly the outcome of their game or match and then artificially produce a result. There are two broad groups of collusion: unintentionally improperly determining a winner and intentionally doing so. The outcome of a match needs to be determined by playing the match. Trading card games have a significant element of randomness to them, and with prizes on the line, instead of looking like a test of skill, it can appear to external evaluators that tournaments are games of chance and consequently should be regulated, like gambling. Those regulations would severely curtail the impact of trading card games and their events, so we want to avoid that. Players can discuss the current board state, tournament placements, and tournament structure, but only from a factual position. A player can reveal cards from their hand or resources, but cannot reveal cards that are hidden information, such as the top card of their deck, even if they know it from another source. A player can say, "We're both X2, and no X2-1s will make the top cut, given current standings." However, a player cannot ask for concession or imply it, saying something like, "A draw here is bad for both of us," or "I'm gonna win this match." Both include opinion and future tournament results or match outcomes and cannot be discussed. We have to allow players to discuss the current board state, otherwise players wouldn't be able to discuss the game. While the context shifts towards the end of the match, that doesn't change that we need to allow them to have those conversations. Now, if players are starting to have a conversation around the outcome of their match, it is best practice to intervene as soon as you can to make sure both players are aware of what they can and can't say. We'd very much rather ensure that players don't offer collusion when we can simply prevent it from happening. Furthermore, if a player attempts collusion, which includes asking for a concession, but they are declined by their opponent, they are not disqualified, but they do receive an escalated penalty and 2 penalty points. Note that bribery does not have this exception. If a player says, "I'll give you half of my packs if you concede," that's both bribery and collusion, and even if their opponent declines, the player will still be disqualified for bribery. However, if a player says, "Hey, we're going to draw, want to roll for it," and their opponent declines, they are not disqualified and only receive the escalated penalty. Now, moving on to stalling. Stalling is when a player intentionally plays slowly to take advantage of the clock. An example is that a player wins a grueling 40-minute game 1 and then spends an excessive amount of time sideboarding and thinking over every decision to spend as much time as possible before they get into the game, because they know that their deck wins slowly, and so they're not going to be able to win another game. So as long as they can prevent their opponent from winning, that's okay. Notably, playing tactically at an appropriate pace in order to draw out the game is not stalling. A player can play for a draw as long as they're playing at an appropriate pace. A player changing pace as the round nears the end is a common signifier, or a player frequently checking the clock. However, as mentioned, a player who's playing methodically and at a normal pace, even if their opponent is playing quickly, is not stalling. Slow play is already very hard to identify and call out, as discussed in the previous lesson. However, with stalling, the head judge now needs to be convinced that the player is playing slowly for a tactical advantage. The head judge should investigate if they believe stalling may be occurring. This is a very difficult task. Moving on to cheating. There are 2 broad categories of cheating: tournament cheating and gameplay cheating. Lying to tournament officials, intentionally altering or misreporting match results, or similar behavior is not allowed and results in disqualification. Gameplay cheating occurs when a player does something illegal, knows that their action is illegal, and does so to gain an advantage, or put their opponent at disadvantage. All 3 criteria must be met in order for a player to have cheated. Anytime you believe a player may have cheated, the head judge should investigate and make a determination. We're going to focus on the more technical aspects in this lesson and not talk about investigation procedures and best practices until we reach the lesson dedicated to them. There are many actions that can be confused with cheating that are not. Let's go over a couple. A player says, "Judge, I cheated. Last turn I didn't attack with my unit, even though my opponent had a sentinel in play. I knew that I had to attack it, but I chose not to make any attacks because I knew that I'd be able to use removal on it and then attack their base." This player thinks that they've done something illegal and did so to gain an advantage. That's 2 out of the 3. But they didn't actually do anything wrong. Similarly, if a player resolves their vigilance by resolving the effects out of the printed order, or resolves one to see what happens before they make their next decision, They may think that they're being shady because that isn't how the card would function in other games, but it is a legal action to take in this one. So even if the player thinks that they've done something illegal and did so to gain an advantage, while we don't want that behavior in our event, they haven't done anything illegal, and so they're not cheating. Sometimes the player doesn't understand the problem. For example, a player registers a 30 HP common red base, but after playing a couple of rounds, they switch to Tarkentown, a rare red base. One of their later round opponents sees Tarkentown and says, "I thought you were playing a 30 HP base. You played my friend in round 1. The player's response is, "Yeah, I registered that one, but after a couple of rounds I felt that Tarkentown was better, so I swapped it out." When you talk with the player, they explain that at their local store, at weekly play, players make changes to their deck every round that they play. It's a normal behavior, and this is their first event outside of their local game store. You're able to corroborate this with other players from that store who are at this event. In this case, the player did something illegal, and they did it to gain advantage, but they didn't know it was illegal. This is also not cheating. Finally, a player realizes that their opponent made a mistake and exhausted 2 resources instead of 3 to play a card. They choose not to call a judge because they don't want their opponent to get a penalty, and they don't think it matters to the rest of the actions in this phase. After a few actions, a spectator notices and calls a judge. While you're investigating, the player freely admits that they saw it happen and didn't call for a judge. They knew that they were supposed to, but they didn't want to get their opponent in trouble, so they just didn't call for a judge. Well, the player has done something wrong. They let a gameplay disruption occur, and they know that it's illegal. They know that they're supposed to call a judge when they see a gameplay disruption happen. Again, however, this is not cheating because they're not gaining an advantage here. However, if it's a situation where a player thinks they're not getting an advantage, for example, they're the one to underplay for a card by 1 and realize later, but also see that there isn't anything that they can do with that 1 extra resource, so they don't call a judge, they've still potentially gained an advantage. Their opponent doesn't know that they can't use that resource, and so might be playing differently. Note that intentionality only applies to cheating and stalling. The other unsporting conduct infractions can be committed by a player who is not aware that those are against the rules of the event. However, it is also a reasonable expectation for players to know that they're not allowed to threaten players, steal, or harass, whereas it's a bit harder to expect players to understand exactly how piloting works precisely, and so we don't need to believe that the player understands the crimes, even minor civil crimes, are not permitted at events. Again, cheating and stalling require a player to be aware of the inappropriate and incorrectness of their action. The others are so problematic and are problematic outside of the context of a tournament that we do not require a player to be aware that they are not allowed specifically at the event, as they are generally not socially acceptable. There are 2 categories that are not currently mentioned in policy: gambling and fraud. Players betting on the outcome of matches can fall under the bribery rules, as it can create external incentives to the tournament for specific outcomes and is not allowed. Furthermore, fraud is when one player registers as another or plays for another player. Players must represent themselves. Committing fraud is one of the more serious infractions, as a suspended player may enter events under a false identity, and that's something that needs to be avoided. Similarly, a player cannot register for a qualifier event as another player and earn that player an invite. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want more Level 2 lessons in your feed, go ahead and subscribe. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays on twitch.tv/SWU_judges for live broadcasts covering the content of these lessons as they are released, and join the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program Discord to join the community in discussion of this and much, much more. As always, good luck and have fun.